Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay, here to review the second Slamboree video. Here we go back to the year prior. We just did Slamboree 1995. Now we're going back to the second Legends reunion in history, Slamboree 1995. 4. And this took place May 22nd, 1994, at the Philadelphia Civic Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of backstage stuff happened with this because two companies come into collision, and that is WCW and the WWF. Now, WCW and ECW, not the WWF, ECW, my bad. Uh, they come into collision. What's happening is ECW earlier in the year had promoted a show called When Worlds Collide, but WCW also had a show teaming up with AAA, the promotion in Mexico, called a show also When Worlds Collide. So Paul Heyman, who had just recently came to ECW and bought into the promotion and is now part owner of the promotion, he sues WCW. So this leads to an agreement between WCW and ECW. Hey, what's up, David? That they will share talents. This was the real alliance. Years before the alliance existed in the WWE, this was the alliance between the original alliance between WCW and ECW, and they agreed to a talent exchange. Basically, that's how they settled this. WCW would send over Bobby Eaton and Arn Anderson, and ECW would send over Terry Funk to wrestle for WCW. The agreement and the working relationship ended between ECW and WCW after Cactus Jack, who was then one half of the WCW Tag Team Champions, spit on the belt. And Ric Flair, who was the booker of WCW, he didn't like that. So basically, that's when their relationship ended, and Eric Bischoff became public enemy number one in the ECW arena. But they had to somehow cater to ECW because they're in ECW's backyard for this event. And just like the prior year, we're honoring many legends for this. You know, the legends of WCW are being inducted into the WCW Hall of Fame. You have Ole Anderson, Penny Banner, Red Bastien, Tully Blanchard, The Crusher, Don Curtis, Terry Funk, Vern Gagne, Hardball Haggerty, Larry Henning, Killer Kowalski, Ernie Ladd, Wahoo McDaniel, Angelo Mosca, Harley Race, Ray Stevens, Lou Thez, Johnny Weaver, Mr. Wrestling 2, and Tommy Young, the referee. Later in the night, The Assassin, Ole Anderson, Harley Race, Ernie Ladd, The Crusher, all inducted into the Hall of Fame. Okay. So basically, like the last year we talked about, this Slamboree is honoring many of the legends. It's basically a Legends reunion. That's what they call it. They did that in 93, they did it in 94, and they did it here. But no Philadelphia legends here, with the exception of Killer Kowalski. Killer Kowalski was an odd choice because he's more closely associated, to me, in my opinion, with the WWF because his town is Boston, and he wrestled most of his matches, famous matches, especially those with Bruno Sammartino in the 1960s, in the WWF territory. But Philly does have a history of of being NWA fans as well, especially in the 80s, because especially in the Philadelphia Spectrum, uh, the NWA would promote the Spectrum, and WWE will be across town in the Philadelphia Civic Arena. So Pennsylvania was a battleground for the NWA and the WWE, especially like I said in the 80s, because the Philly crowd was very tough, and they liked, they were smart fans. They were plugged into all all of wrestling. So, and they appreciated the guys from the NWA because the guys from the NWA had a better in-ring product than the guys from the WWF in the 80s. So Philadelphia, even though it wasn't traditionally part of an NWA territory, it would in the 80s it became a battleground between the two promotions. And that's why when Joel Goodhart, the original founder of ECW, started ECW in 1989 as the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance, he had people on his cards that were both NWA legends and WWE legends from the 1980s because Philly saw them both and Philly loved them both. Philly's a hardcore wrestling town. So, what about the matches on this show? Well, there was supposed to be a match, a Legends match, involving Bob Armstrong. Uh, but it isn't. His sons will be wrestling Brad and Brian. And this will be the last time you'll see Brian Armstrong because Brian Armstrong will soon make his way to the WWF as the roadie. But of course, the Armstrongs, a stalwarts of WCW, and later on they developed something called the Armstrong Curse. It seemed like members of the Armstrong family could not, especially Brad Armstrong, could not win a match. You know, so despite being the most closely associated with WCW in out of all these people, the Armstrongs still get disrespected, and they still they still lose the opening match. Steve Austin defeats Johnny B. Bad singles match for the United States Championship. Yeah, Johnny B. Bad is an interesting relic of the 1990s WCW. They liked him. He was promoted. He was television champion in '94, but here he hadn't gotten to the level. But they had a pretty good match. They had pretty good chemistry. Mark Merrow and Steve Austin always had chemistry with each other, going back to their WCW days, and that's why WWE puts them together when they both come to that company. But here they were just pushing B Bad. He didn't win any championships yet. That wouldn't come until September. And then we get to the first Legends match: Tully Blanchard versus Terry Funk. Now remember, I said that Terry Funk is on loan from ECW. He's got kind of been revitalized in ECW. The last time that we saw Terry Funk in mainstream wrestling was in 1989 when he left WCW. He had the feud with Flair, the greatest audition of the Great American Bash ever, the Great American Bash 1989. And Terry Funk took on Ric Flair in an I Quit match in that event. So then, he got fired and he went on the Indies and he wrestled for Initially, the NWA by Dennis was promoted by Dennis Coralluzzo, promoter from New Jersey. But when he started to do business with Eastern Championship Wrestling, uh, Terry Funk switched sides and made his presence known and made his allegiance known. He switched sides from the NWA to ECW, and Terry Funk became the guy in ECW who basically made all the legends. He was the resident legend of ECW. The night the lines were crossed, an event in 1994 featuring a match between himself, Shane Douglas, and Sabu became the first triple threat match in wrestling history ever. And Terry Funk would go on to do phenomenal things in ECW with Cactus Jack. He would go on to win the ECW championship in 1997 against Raven at ECW's first pay-per-view. But here he's on loan from ECW to WCW. So he's returning to WCW for the first time in 5 years. He hasn't been here since '89, and he's taking on Tully Blanchard. It's good to see Tully Blanchard back in the company. He was supposed to come back in '93 as the Horseman reunion with all the Horsemen, but when he failed the drug test, they put Paul Roma in his place, and that was at Slamboree 2 years before this. But now there's no Horseman, and it's just a regular Legends match. It's a pretty good match, but it ends in a double disqualification. Now here we have Lord Steven Regal taking on Larry Zbyszko. Now who better at the Legends reunion to take on Lord Steven Regal and step out of his comfort zone? Larry was just an announcer, but Regal kept picking on him, so finally Larry comes out of retirement and is taking on Regal. And who better, like I said, to do this than at the Legends reunion, the living legend himself, Larry Zbyszko. And he defeats Lord Steven Regal, and he would go on later in the year to win the television championship. I remember it was so weird seeing Larry Zbyszko, an announcer, with the television championship. Now we have a rematch from the previous month's pay-per-view. Dustin Rhodes defeats Bunkhouse Buck with Colonel Parker. Now, since 1990, since the latter part of 1993, Colonel Rob Parker has been coming out issuing challenges to Dustin Rhodes. He's basically created this stable to fight Dustin Rhodes, right? He started off, Dustin challenged his man, Stunning Steve Austin, challenged Dustin Rhodes for the United States Championship at Starrcade 1993. They had a two out of three falls match between them. The lights went out. It was a great match. Steve Austin versus Dustin Rhodes, Starrcade '93. And they had a feud going into the February pay-per-view Super Brawl 4. But now Austin's kind of doing his own thing. Colonel Rob Parker is really not in his corner anymore, but he still has it out for Dustin Rhodes. So he brings in what we didn't know was his cousin at the time. Well, some people did. People that watched like the Pensacola territory or the Alabama territory, the Fullers, where they promoted. But I didn't. I didn't even know who I knew him as Colonel Rob Parker. I didn't know him as Rob Fuller. But people that were familiar with his territory in Alabama and his work as the Tennessee Stud knew that Jimmy Golden, this man, Bunkhouse Buck, was his cousin. And Bunkhouse Buck and Dustin Rhodes have a hell of a match. One of the bloodiest matches I've ever seen at Spring Stampede 1994. But they come here and they have the rematch. Basically, and it's a bull rope match. And basically, Terry Funk interferes. So Terry Funk becomes a member of Colonel Robert Parker's stud stable. So this is kind of a permanent gig for Terry Funk for a while. So now it's Bunkhouse Buck and Terry Funk against Dustin Rhodes. His father's old rival, the man who called his father an egg-sucking dog, the man who defeated Dusty Rhodes for the NWA Championship in 1975. Terry Funk going against the son, Dustin Rhodes. And that will carry us to Bash at the Beach, 1994, the tag match. Now, this one also involved Colonel Rob Parker, and this one was a little bit funny because there was supposed to be a mystery opponent. There was talk about a mystery opponent for Ric Flair. This is a WCW title match. Ric Flair won the WCW Championship from Vader at Starrcade 93. And successful title defenses against Vader at Super Bowl IV. That was basically it. But they were talking about a mystery opponent. Now, nobody knew who the mystery opponent was going to be. A lot of people were speculating that it was going to be Hulk Hogan, and the Colonel Rob Parker was going to be bringing this person out. But because Hogan was in talks with WCW at this time. And I didn't know this. Unbeknownst to me, I had no idea. And they kind of hinted at this slightly. But Rob Fuller was instrumental in Hogan's start. Although Hogan started in the Florida territory, in Eddie Graham's part of Florida, because the Fullers and stuff, their territory extended not only to Alabama, but Pensacola, Tallahassee, stuff. That was their territory. So Hogan started in southern Florida, but he moved up to Mobile, to the Alabama territory after that, right? Louis Tillett was the promoter in addition to the Fullers, right? So they were instrumental in getting Hogan started in the 70s. Now, I didn't know this at the time, so they were kind of pointing to that since Robert Fuller and Hogan had a history. Maybe he's the surprise opponent. It didn't make any sense because Colonel Rob Parker is a heel. Why would he manage Hulk Hogan? Why would he? But this is what they were pointing to. It wasn't Hulk Hogan. It was Barry Windham, and they were basically doing nothing with him in WCW. Ric Flair makes quick work of him. Barry was supposed to go to the WWF at this time and join Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation, where him and Mike Rotunda would revive their team of the U.S. Express from the 80s, and they would become the New Money Incorporated. And maybe if that would have happened, maybe they would have won the championships. Who knows? Because to me, every time Barry Windham came to the WWF, they dropped the ball with him every single time after 85. You know what I mean? Like, he came back in 88. He was the Widowmaker. He came back in 90, in '96 he was the Stalker. '97 he was fucking the new Blackjacks, his dad's gimmick. He was fucking part of that NWA faction in 1998. So WWE never knew what to do with Barry Windham, but it was cool seeing a Barry Windham Ric Flair match. I mean, of course, it wasn't anything like close to like it was in the late '80s, but I mean, they did the best they could. Now we get to a wild and crazy match. That is Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan defeating the Nasty Boys. And this is a Broad Street Bully match with hockey player Dave Schultz as the referee. Philadelphia Flyers legend, so of course. This match was everywhere. Like a Broad Street Bully match. It was basically a street fight. And the Nasty Boys were great at this time, and so was Kevin Sullivan and Cactus Jack. The story behind this was that the Equalizer, who was Dave Sullivan, who was formerly the Equalizer, he on an episode of WCW Pro, he was getting picked on by the Nasty Boys, and he said, after this, I'm going to bring my bigger brother. And everybody was like, who's your brother, right? Who's your brother? And the brother turns, and the inside joke is that Kevin Sullivan is shorter than the guy that plays the Equalizer, who we later come to call Dave. He gets a gimmick change, Dave Sullivan. So he brings him back to WCW kayfabe wise. Kevin has just left ECW and has come back to WCW to take the book. And they team up initially to take on the Nasty Boys, but after Max Payne, because Max Payne and Cactus Jack were a team, and they had some matches with the Nasty Boys, like at Spring Stampede. But after that is no longer a thing, all of a sudden Kevin Sullivan and Cactus Jack start teaming up, and they become like an enemy tag team. Like they're enemies, but they're friends when they're tag team partners and tag team champions. But they have a crazy ass match, and they win the tag team championships. Now we get to Sting versus Vader, the final match of the evening. Now, this was supposed to be for the international champion. Well, no, Sting is the international champion. It was supposed to be, initially, when they started to book it, it was Sting versus Rick Rude, right? But Sting and Rick Rude had a match in Japan in which Rick Rude had got injured, his neck injured, and it forced him out of wrestling. So they called an audible. They knew Sting and Vader had amazing chemistry, so they put Sting in there with Vader. The previous month, Sting had defeated Rick Rude at Spring Stampede with interference from Vader's manager, Harley Race. No, they didn't have an Intercontinental. They had an International Championship, David. What this was, well, in 1993, when Eric Bischoff took over for WCW, he wanted to have the television tapings in Disney MGM Studios, right? But in order to do this, he would have to tape several shows in advance. So if there was a title change, like there was a title change, Ric Flair was the champion, right? Ric Flair was the NWA champion. This goes back to '93. Ric Flair was the NWA champion, and they wanted to show the title change, which Rick Rude wins it. Rick Rude beats Ric Flair at Full Brawl 94 to become the NWA champion. But the NWA board of directors, because there's other promoters in the NWA besides WCW, there's other organizations, they don't like the fact that WCW is basically giving away these results of the title change without consulting them. But WCW feels like their association, especially Eric Bischoff, their association with the NWA is hamstringing them, it's holding them back. So what are they going to do? They still have the NWA championship. They still have the big gold belt. But the NWA prohibits them from calling it that. So what they do is they come up with a name for it called the International Championship. And this is the big gold belt, David. So no, they don't have an Intercontinental Championship. Their version of the Intercontinental Championship was basically the United States title. Because the United States Championship, as we know it today, was used initially by the WWE, and Bobo Brazil held it, but that was in the 60s. It comes into existence even before that because the champion can't, the world champion can't wrestle every single show. So when the world champion was out of town during like the NWA days, when the world champion was out of town, the United States champion would step in for him and he would defend it. And traditionally, the United States champion was the number one contender to the world heavyweight title. But in WWE, they developed the Intercontinental Championship in 1979. Because after they left the NWA, they no longer had access to the United States champion or the North American champion, which that was another championship used in some promotions, David, such as Mid-South Wrestling, as like their main title, the North American Championship. And that was in the 70s, that was held by Ted DiBiase in the late 70s when he wrestled in Madison Square Garden. I think he had like Ted DiBiase, I think, in his initial run in New York, had one of Hulk Hogan's first matches in his initial run in New York in 79. But when after, like, again, they dissolved their relationship, they, being the WWE, dissolved their relationship with the NWA in the early 80s, they needed another champ. In the late 70s and early 80s, they needed another champion. So they had the South American champion. So finally, Pat Patterson, they decide on Pat Patterson in 1979 to be the first intercontinental, basically combining all the continents, basically a world champion under a different name, the Intercontinental Champion. So yes, the WCW didn't need an Intercontinental Championship, David, because they had the original, the United States Championship. So that's the answer. But for a while, they had this belt, the International World Heavyweight Title, because they couldn't call it the NWA title. So they had to come up with a new name for it, the International Championship. And this was held by Rick Rude after he beat Flair. This was later held by Sting again. And then finally, in August of 94, Sting and Flair have a unification match, and they put an end to the two world titles in WCW, and the big gold belt, the former international title, becomes the WCW world title. Once again, so yeah, that was this championship, the international title, held by Sting. So Sting retains. There's no So there's no Hulk Hogan on this pay-per-view. This is the last pay-per-view that is not of the Hogan era. Hogan is not here yet in WCW. The next pay-per-view after this will be Bash at the Beach 1994, and the Hulk Hogan era will begin because that's when he'll have his big match with Flair. Flair is a babyface coming into this event and going out of this event, but pretty soon they'll be turning Flair, and they'll be turning him by him basically having challenging Hulk Hogan and having a match with Sting for the unification of the international title and the WCW title. And Sherry will be his manager. Sherry's coming from ECW, where she was managing Shane Douglas. So the answer is, David, they didn't have it because they didn't need it. Their secondary title was the U.S. title. And their third title was the television title because sometimes the U.S. champion couldn't defend it, so they needed another champion, the television champion. One thing about the television title is, remember, titles really weren't defended on TV. That was mostly for house shows. A secondary title like the U.S. title or the Intercontinental title was for a B town, and the world title was for the A towns. This was the way it was in all promotions. So you get Hulk Hogan on top in New York City, and in Long Island, say you'd get the Ultimate Warrior on top when he was Intercontinental Champion. Same thing probably in WCW. The U.S. champion that does the B towns, and the world champion does the A towns, and the TV champion or the tag champs do the C town. Way out there. But with the TV champ, one thing was always guaranteed because he was the TV champ. The TV champ would always defend his title on TV. So if you were guaranteed a main event title match, most of the time on TV, the one defending it was the TV champ. WWE didn't have a TV champ, so a lot of times you wouldn't see the television title. They wouldn't see a title defended in the WWE usually on TV. The IC or the world or the WWF Championship. That was the difference. The IC belt was sometimes defended, but more often than not, you would never see a title match on WWF TV. They were all jobber matches and squash matches. When I was a kid, when I first started watching wrestling, the way that I understood in my kid brain the difference between WWF and WCW was that I thought WCW was called World Championship Wrestling because they had more championships than the WWE. I'm like, damn, WWE, because WWE only had 3. They only had the WWF Championship, the Intercontinental Championship, and the tag belts. That was the only 3 they had. They didn't have any others. They later added the European Championship and the Hardcore Championship, but that was it. WCW at one time had 2 world titles, the tag team titles. At one time they had two tag team titles. At one time they had the U.S. tag team title and the world tag team title. One time they had a 6-man title. One time they had the NWA tag team champions and the WCW tag team champions. So they had a lot of championships. So I thought as a kid, I'm like, they're World Championship Wrestling because they have so many championships. But no, that wasn't the case. But Vader and Sting have amazing chemistry here, but I thought they were going to. I didn't know about Rick Rude's injury. I thought Rude was going to come back and turn babyface against Vader because that's the way they made it look at Spring Stampede, that it was him and Vader. It was going to be him and Vader. For So we have uh, Lord Steven Regal going into the feud with Larry Zbyszko. Again, like I said, Zbyszko will become television champion. Good night, Lise. So Zbyszko will become television champion. Defeating Regal. Regal was to me was the best TV champion in WCW because, like I said, he always defended it. And like the thing about Regal when he was TV champ is the babyface would be beating him, and they would come this close. Whether it was Arn Anderson at Super Bowl IV or Ricky the Dragon Steamboat when he first won it at Fall Brawl '93, the babyface would come this close, and under the television time limit constraints, Regal would get away with it. So when I look at the old WCW TV title during the Steve Regal era, of Lord Steven Regal, fun. It brings back a lot of memories because to me, he had a lot of good matches under that. That's when I first became aware of William Regal, and like I became a fan of his lordship. Mm-hmm. Pretty Wonderful is here. They just formed. They formed. The first time we saw them team up was against Marcus Alexander Bagwell and Two Gold Scorpio at Starrcade 1993. They had the masked assassin Jody Hamilton in their corner. This was a thrown together team because after the experiment of Paul Roma and the Four Horsemen didn't last, they're like, oh, he's Paul Roma and the other guy's Paul Orndorff. Let's just put them together as he's Pretty Paul Roma, he's Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Let's just put Orndorff and Roma together as a team, and they're pretty good as a team. They will, 2 months from now, they will take on Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan, who's just won the tag team championships at this pay-per-view, and Pretty Wonderful will defeat them at Bash at the Beach 1994. So that's Slamboree '94. And I give this a fucking C minus. I mean, not many matches were good on this show. The main event was decent. Like I said, Vader and Sting have amazing chemistry. The surprise opponent to Ric Flair was a letdown. I hate it when, man, most of the time, look, surprise opponents and surprise partners never live up to the hype. I mean, who can remember Survivor Series 1996? Who's going to be the surprise opponent for the surprise partner for the baby faces? And we're all thinking Macho Man is coming back to the WWF, right? And it ends up being Jimmy Superfly Snuka. I mean, look at this WrestleMania. We're guessing everybody for Randy Orton's surprise opponent. And who does it end up being? Nobody that we wanted. Not Aleister Black, not Rusev, but Joe Hendry. So again, most of the time, with the exception of Survivor Series 1990, when the surprise partner was The Undertaker, most of the time, the surprise opponent or surprise partner doesn't live up to the hype. And here it clearly didn't. I mean, Ric Flair and Barry Windham was probably interesting in, again, 1988, and even the year before, 93, when Flair first came back. the first person he confronted was Barry Windham, because Barry Windham won the NWA Championship that night at Super Brawl 3 from Muta, and it was Ric Flair who put it on him. You know what I mean? So, and it was Ric Flair who took it off him the net like a couple months later at Beach Blast, right? So that was intriguing because of their history. They fought each other, and then Wyndham was a horseman. But Barry Windham was very much past his prime at this point, and the reveal was very anticlimactic. They built it up to be Hulk Hogan, but it wasn't. They just started talking about Hogan like in April. uh, coming to WCW. Right now, he's still on Thunder in Paradise, and he's still involved with the Vince McMahon trial, which is definitely underway, and that's probably the biggest talk in the world of professional wrestling. But WCW is on the verge of stuff that is big too, and we'll see what that is by July. But anyway, I'm gonna go back and do 93 because 93 is real interesting too because that's the first time they come up with this concept, and it's basically covered in Legends matches. You know, you have Nick Bockwinkel versus Dory Funk Jr., and they think that this is still a selling point in 1993, NWA versus AWA. Maybe it is for some older fans. You know, you have Vern Gagne in one guy's corner, right? In Bockwinkel's corner, and then you have on the NWA Legends in the corner of Dory Funk. And Bockwinkel, of course, besides Vern Gagne, Bockwinkel was the face of the NWA, and they like him so much in WCW, they bring him in as the on-air commissioner later on. But he makes his return to the ring in the Legends match here, and then you have another Legends match. Thunderbolt Patterson, a Georgia legend, and Brad Armstrong, a Georgia legend, going against two of the greatest foreigner characters ever, Baron von Raschke and Ivan Koloff, one from the Soviet Union and one from Nazi Germany. You have Ole Anderson returning to the Omni with the Horsemen reunion, basically a city that was sacred to the Horsemen, recalling memories of when the Horsemen formed. But it was anticlimactic because Paul Roma was the guy, and Paul Roma was not a Horseman. Then you have the Hollywood Blondes, Steve Austin and Brian Pillman, take on, well, what was supposed to be Shane Douglas and Ricky Steamboat, but ends up being Tom Zank and Ricky Steamboat, the Z-Man. And they win the tag team championships. So. And then you have Vader versus the British Bulldog. This is the British Bulldog's year in the WCW, because he left the WWF. He had the greatest year ever, Wembley Stadium, 1992, packed out crowd to see him. He wins the Intercontinental Championship against Bret Hart, but then he gets busted in WWF. So the only people will take him is WCW. So he ends up in WCW, and in Slamboree 93, he takes on Vader for the championship. And if he didn't fuck up in WCW and almost get the company sued by beating up a fan, right, because they said something disrespectful to his wife, he might have stayed in WCW and became a world champion there. Because WCW was looking to expand the market internationally. to England because they saw how much of a big star Davey was in the early 90s. So that's Slamboree 93. But for this one, Slamboree 94, the best match was Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan versus the Nasty Boys. I don't care what people say. The Nasty Boys, to me, in their second go around in WCW, when they came back in '93, from beating the Horsemen to having the matches they had with Max Payne and Cactus Jack, to turning face in September, the team with Dusty Rhodes and Dustin Rhodes. They had a hell of a year in '94. '95, shit would start to get repetitive with them. They had a million matches with the Harlem Heat, which I did like the Tupelo match they had in Uncensored '95. I had no idea of the history of it. You know what I mean? I didn't know about the Tupelo concession stand brawl in 1979 with uh, with uh, Larry Lathan and Wayne Ferris against Jerry Jarrett. You know, I had no idea about that. You know, I didn't even know. Well, I knew what the USWA was, yeah, because of Jerry Lawler and because of Jeff Jarrett and because of Men on a Mission in WWF. But I didn't know about USWA when it was Continental in the '70s. Or no idea what a Tupelo concession stand brawl even was. So when I saw the Nasty Boys and the Harlem Heat do it, I'm like, damn. Didn't know anything about Jerry Lawler. Didn't know anything about Larry Lathan or Wayne Ferris. I knew Wayne Ferris, but I didn't know I knew Wayne Ferris. I know Wayne Ferris, of course, from the WWF as the Honky Tonk Man, but I didn't see him in Memphis in those days with Larry Lathan going against Bill Dundee and Jerry Lawler. Had no idea. So when I saw the Nasty Boys and Harlem Heat do it, I'm like, oh shit, they're involving catch up. They're throwing food on each other. I thought it was something new. I had no idea. You know what I mean? It didn't mean anything to me that, oh, they're in Tupelo, Mississippi, and this is where the first one took place in '79 because I didn't know it existed. But now that I do know, it's a cool nod to history, just like with Ole Anderson in the Omni, a nod to history twice that he twice he basically turned on Dusty Rhodes. One time forming the Horsemen in '85, and of course the original angle where it was him and Dusty versus the Assassins. Where he basically caused a riot in Atlanta. But yes, Memphis territory was known for their gimmicks, and they were the original inspiration for ECW. People say no, they weren't, but they absolutely were, because not only if if ECW was inspired by FMW, which it was, Kasuchi 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 Okada took what he learned in Memphis and took it back to Japan, and he created a hardcore wrestling promotion in Japan as FMW. But Eddie Gilbert, who was the original booker for ECW, he was inspired by Memphis because he created the territory basically to be a northeastern Memphis. He was going to be Jerry Lawler, um, and uh, ECW was going to be his kingdom, and he was going to make stars like Shane Douglas. But he passed away, unfortunately, and he later before he passed away, he left ECW. He was on the outs with ECW because he didn't like the fact that they started to work with Jim Crockett. But ironically enough, because Jim Crockett in the early '90s, uh, 93, 92, 93, wanted to get back into professional wrestling. He had this idea that now the WCW was his family's company was owned by Ted Turner, but he was going to create the World Wrestling Network, and he was going to involve Paul Lee in that, and be heavily involved, and Todd Gordon be heavily involved with ECW, but that turned out not to be because Paul Lee said fuck the NWA, and in August of 1994, this same year, in the finals for the ECW championship and the NWA championship, believe it or not, Shane Douglas defeats Too Cold Scorpio, and he tells all the NWA legends that they can all kiss his ass. And Eastern Championship Wrestling becomes Extreme Championship Wrestling. So, and it was on my birthday too. August, ECW, technically ECW as we know it, is as Extreme Championship Wrestling. Uh, Formed on my birthday in 1994, basically my ninth birthday. Was I watching it? No, because the station that ECW came on in New York was Madison Square Garden Network, and I watched the Rangers games on there and the Knicks games, but I didn't watch wrestling on there because it came on so late. I could barely stay up for WCW Worldwide, and I'd be forcing myself to stay up for that, the syndication showing for WCW. But I found it cool that ECW and WCW did something together because we often hear about the relationship between ECW and the WWE. That was a more stronger relationship, but WCW had a relationship with um, ECW too. It's easy to forget. So they're coming together with ECW for a while anyway, and they're dissolving their relationship or have dissolved their relationship with the NWA. That's why they can't call it the Big Gold Belt title the NWA title. They can call it the International title, but pretty soon that will become the WCW Championship soon, like the fucking next show, the June Clash of Champions. There's a unification match, Flair and Sting, and Flair wins it with help from Sherry. Sherry injured Sting so much that they had an interactive match between Sting and Flair on WCW Saturday Night. And going into Bash at the Beach, Sherry rakes Sting's eyes and causes him to miss that pay-per-view and miss a television title opportunity against Lord Steven Regal that Johnny B. Bad takes his place. But yeah, that's it for Slamboree 1994. Like I said, probably the best Slamboree was probably Slamboree 1997. We're not there yet. And that is the main event for that is Roddy Piper, Kevin Green, and Ric Flair going against the NWO. And when we get there, we will talk about it. Some people like Slamboree 98. When we get to Slamboree 98, see you, David. When we get to Slamboree 98, I will talk about how I was duped into ordering this pit. Others come out right and say it. There was an angle where Eric Bischoff challenged Vince McMahon to a fight because DX had just invaded WCW Monday Nitro in Norfolk, Virginia, and uh, Bischoff saw this, and Bischoff was like, "Oh, they want to play hardball. I'll play hardball." And he challenged Vince to a match, and they're promoting this match, Vince McMahon versus Eric Bischoff, like it's really going to happen. And stupid me believes, oh well, if they mention it on TV, it's probably going to happen, right? So I ordered the pay-per-view, and of course, no Vince. He claims he was at Stephanie McMahon's graduation that night. But hey, what can you do? And I also get disappointed because Scott Hall turns heel. He turns on Kevin Nash, and for a while, that's the end of the Outsiders, paving the way for Big Show and Sting to win the tag team championships for a while, even though Big Show is now a heel and Sting is a babyface. And that will that will lead to Sting's choice of joining NWO Wolfpack, which was a great moment in May of 1998. May. Speaking of the Wolfpack, fast forward 4 years from the topic we're covering here. On May 4th, 1998, the Wolfpack formed. That's when they revealed their colors, because there was a storyline with Hulk Hogan where after he lost the WCW title to Sting at Starrcade, he started to blame other NWO members, particularly Kevin Nash and Randy Savage. And the NWO doesn't come out to help Randy Savage when he loses a match to Luger at 98 Sold Out. So now Hogan is starting to attack Randy Savage. Randy Savage is starting to attack Bischoff. And Randy Savage is starting to have matches where he's teaming with Sting, he's teaming with Luger, the WCW baby faces. But he has a match with Sting at Spring Stampede. And who comes out to help him? Kevin Nash. So him and Kevin Nash form an alliance, and that becomes the genesis of the Wolfpack. But on May 4th, 1998, they came out with their colors, the NWO black and red t-shirt, the hottest selling t-shirt in the year of 1998. That's 4 years from the topic we're talking about. The NWO wasn't even a thought. Hulk Hogan wasn't even in WCW yet. WCW was very different in 94 than 98. Just 4 years difference, but it was like light years ahead. And like I said, WWF is gearing up for their King of the Ring, and King of the Ring will be the launching off pad for their new era, the new generation era. They promote it as the new generation era, even though that pay-per-view, King of the Ring 98, is headlined by Roddy Piper versus Jerry Lawler, two guys from the previous era, the 80s, two 80s wrestlers. So, how is the new generation era when you you're featuring these old wrestlers? You know what I mean? Whatever. But that's a funny one, King of the Ring '94. Maybe we'll cover that one day on the channel with Art Donovan. How much this guy weigh? How much this guy weigh? They're not doing anything in May of '94. Nothing. WWF is doing nothing. They're just coming off WrestleMania 10, and they're basically building to King of the Ring '94 as a showcase for Owen Hart. For two of the greatest matches of Owen Hart's career, Razor Ramon in the I mean, 1-2-3 Kid in the semifinals and Razor Ramon in the finals. And an amazing match the same night too that Bret had against Diesel. It was like Kevin Nash's first showcase as a main eventer. But that's King of the Ring '94. So out of the two in around this period of time for '94, I say King of the Ring '94 was better than Slamboree '94. You know, once again, WCW's pay-per-views sucked. Although the best pay-per-view in '94 for WCW, in my opinion, was Spring Stampede. Spring Stampede had Steve Austin versus Muta. It had Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat, and it had the Dustin Rhodes Bunkhouse Bloodfest. But ironically enough, they don't bring it back in '95. They don't bring it. Actually, they don't bring it back until like '97. The pay-per-view Spring Stampede, which is crazy because I thought '94 was a good showing, especially that fucking Ricky Steamboat Ric Flair match. Peace. Good night, David. Good night, Lisa. Okay, there's a request from David. WWF Backlash 2000. Okay. All right, David, we'll do that one. Do that one tomorrow. That one there, it takes place in the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. And it's headlined with The Rock and Triple H. So yeah, that's one. That's one we'll do tomorrow. Is Backlash 2000, and it's crazy because that's the match that they had there was the match that they should have had at that year's WrestleMania. The Rock versus Triple H, not the fucking Four Corners match they had. I'll never forgive them for that. We had a perfect event. The Rock and Triple H building to that. Brock's first time in the WrestleMania main event as a baby face, and he fucking doesn't win. Winning the Royal Rumble, but not winning the championship. But he wins it at Backlash, but like he wins it at Backlash. So he couldn't win the belt at WrestleMania when it counted, but he wins it at Backlash. Okay, great. But I guess this is current because The Rock and Triple H have a real life feud going on in TKO HQ, right? So we take a look back at their on-screen rivalry in the year 2000. Y2K. Peace.